Hi everyone, today we're doing a Halloween mummy meatloaf. You're going to need a meatloaf recipe for this, a fairly large one. You can use whatever recipe you'd like, as long as it uses about 2 pounds of ground beef. This is a recipe I use every once in a while at home. That's 1 package of stovetop stuffing, 3/4 of a cup of water, and then I blend that together and just let it sit for a few minutes just to soften up the dressing a little bit. Then in a large bowl I place 2 pounds of lean ground beef, and then I add about half a teaspoon of pepper and a half a teaspoon of salt. I add 1 egg and then about a half a cup of shredded cheddar cheese. And then using a spoon, or the best method in my opinion, your hands, just mush that around and combine it all together. And then you're going to find yourself a fairly shallow baking dish that you're going to spray with cooking spray. Then take your meatloaf mixture and just form it into a skull shape. And this is where you can use your artistic abilities to do this. I found this idea in a Women's Day magazine many years ago. So I just formed it into a rough skull shape, and I added eyes and a mouth. The details don't have to be specific because you're going to be putting mummy wrappings over top of everything anyway. And then you're going to bake it partially for 20 minutes at 350 degrees. While that's baking, you're going to roll out some pie pastry. I'll put the recipe that I use in the description box below. Roll it out fairly thin, and then you're going to cut it using a pizza cutter into 1/2 inch strips. That's enough pastry there for about a pie's worth of pastry, 9-inch pie. There is the meatloaf partially baked, and then you're going to add the wrappings. I was afraid that the wrappings would burn or get way too dark and overcooked if I didn't pre-bake the meatloaf a little bit. And I'm glad I did, and I would have baked it a little bit longer than 20 minutes the next time. And I'll show you why in a minute. So add the wrappings. You can add as many or as few as you'd like. And while that's baking in the oven at 350 degrees for another hour or so, you can make some spicy homemade ketchup to go with it if you'd like. To make that, need 12 ounces of tomato paste, 2/3 of a cup of water, 4 tablespoons of cider vinegar or plain white vinegar, half a teaspoon of dry mustard, half a teaspoon of cinnamon, half a teaspoon of salt, half a teaspoon of garlic powder, 1/4 teaspoon of cloves, 1/4 teaspoon of onion powder, 1/4 teaspoon of allspice, half a teaspoon of cayenne pepper, more or less to taste, and 1/2 cup of brown sugar. Just stir that together. It's ready to use just the way it is. I heated mine up on the stove a little bit just to make it hot. And I simmered it for about 5 minutes until it was nice and bubbly. There's the mummy meatloaf. I cooked it until the center of the brain was at 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Now for the eyes, I boiled an egg, and that is some of the egg white, and I took an olive slice. Black olives would have been better, but all I had was green, and I stuck a caper in the center of it. Then I placed one of the egg whites in the spaces I had left in the wrappings. One of them the space was a bit too small, so I had a kind of a hard time squishing the eye in there. So when you do the wrappings, make sure you leave lots of room for the eyes afterwards. Then I put some of that homemade ketchup in a Ziploc bag with the corner cut off, and I just drew on some veins to make it look like bloodshot eyes. Then I transferred the whole head onto a serving platter, and then I added some of that homemade ketchup all the way around. And that is the completed mummy head. There it is. I think he looks great, kind of gross looking, but that's what you're trying to shoot for. It is Halloween after all. If I were to make this again, I'd do a couple of things different. I would leave more room for the eyes. I'd maybe put a few less wrappings. There it is when it's cut up, which looks even more gross. I would also pre-bake it for at least 40 minutes prior to putting the wrappings on, and that way the wrappings wouldn't be quite as dark. But I still think it turned out great, and I think it'd be a really fun thing to make for a Halloween meal, for a Halloween party. So give it a try.